I'm Amanda. I'm 35, a mother to two amazing kids, Jack and Emma, who are 10 years old. Life had been a whirlwind of changes the past 2 years, changes I didn't see coming. After my divorce from David, my kids and I found ourselves living with my parents. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But when you're a pediatric nurse working 12-hour shifts, you can't exactly do it all on your own. At least, that's what I told myself when I agreed to their offer. The truth is, I didn't want to need help, but I also didn't want to risk being completely alone, struggling to make ends meet. My relationship with my parents had always been a bit strained. They had their favorites, Stephen, my younger brother, who could do no wrong in their eyes. But I thought, for the kids' sake, it might be worth trying to make it work. We settled in quickly. The twins were adjusting well. Jack was his usual creative self, always sketching or building something. Emma was more athletic, full of confidence, and never afraid to stand up for herself. As we settled into my parents' house, things seemed good at first. My dad converted his home office into a bedroom for the kids, and I took the guest room. I helped with groceries, did most of the cooking, and did my best to respect their routines. I wanted this arrangement to work. But things started to shift. My brother Stephen and his wife Melissa had their first baby, Ethan, and suddenly my kids seemed invisible. I never imagined my own parents would treat their first grandchild so differently, but when little Ethan came into the picture, everything changed. At first, it was subtle, small things, like the extra attention Ethan got at family dinners or the expensive baby gear they bought even though Stephen and Melissa already had a perfectly good house. But the longer we stayed, the clearer it became, Jack and Emma were not their priority anymore. The tipping point came when my parents decided to renovate their house for Stephen and Melissa, completely disregarding our living situation. They wanted to help by turning the dining room into a nursery, even though Stephen and his family already had their own home. I was confused, frustrated, and hurt. My parents were making decisions about our lives without even consulting me, and the more they favored Stephen and his family, the more I felt like a guest in my own home. But I had no choice but to swallow my anger and keep my head down. Still, I reminded myself every day that this was temporary. I was saving money, doing everything I could to make the best of it. I told Jack and Emma that we'd be out of here soon, that we'd have our own place by Christmas. But as the months went on, I realized just how much worse things were getting. To be continued. As summer turned into fall, the tension in the house grew. My parents began questioning every decision I made regarding Jack and Emma. From what I fed them to how I disciplined them, nothing seemed to meet their approval. At the same time, Stephen and Melissa were allowed to do no wrong. I kept telling myself it was temporary, just a few more months until we could move out. But each day, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a hole I couldn't escape. Stephen's and Melissa's treatment of their baby was something else entirely. I couldn't help but compare it to how my children were treated. My kids had always been the center of attention when they were younger, but now they seemed to fade into the background. When Ethan cried, my mother would drop everything to tend to him. If Jack or Emma had a problem, I was left to deal with it on my own. It wasn't just about favoritism anymore. It was about complete disregard for Jack and Emma. When Emma had been selected to represent her class at a district-wide art exhibition, I was so proud of her. I rushed to show my parents, hoping they'd share in my excitement. But my mother was too busy helping Melissa pick out new curtains. She barely acknowledged Emma's achievement before brushing it aside. Then there was Jack, who had always been so enthusiastic about his art projects. One day, he came home excited to show his latest work. He had been chosen to represent his class in a district-wide exhibition, a huge honor. I couldn't wait for my parents to see it, but when I showed my mother, she waved him away with a terse, "Not now, Jack, I'm helping Melissa with the curtains." The pain in his eyes was unbearable. For the first time, I saw just how deeply he was affected by the favoritism. He had always been a happy, confident child, but now he seemed withdrawn, his usual spark dimming. By the end of September, things had reached a boiling point. Stephen called a family meeting, and Melissa sat beside him, Ethan in her lap. "We've got some exciting news," Stephen began, his eyes flicking to my parents. "We're finally doing that major renovation on our house, the one we've been talking about for ages." My heart sank. I didn't even need to hear the rest. I knew what was coming. My mother clasped her hands together in delight. "That's wonderful, sweetie," she beamed. "But Melissa trailed off, bouncing Ethan on her knee. "We'll need somewhere to stay during the construction. It should only be about 6 to 8 weeks. Before I could process the words, my father eagerly chimed in, "Of course, you'll stay here, we have plenty of room." I opened my mouth trying to speak, but my words got stuck. "Actually, we're already a bit tight on space." I began, but my mother's cold glare silenced me. "Family helps family, Amanda," she said, her voice final. "It's only temporary." And just like that, the decision was made. No one consulted me, no one considered the impact it would have on Jack and Emma. The message was clear. They weren't just second-class citizens in this house, they weren't even welcome. My parents and Stephen had already made up their minds. Stephen and Melissa moved in the following weekend, and the changes began immediately. The twins' room, which had been their haven, was now a shared space. Their toys were shoved into boxes and tucked away in the corner of the living room, labeled clutter. They were told to keep their voices down during the day because Ethan is napping. I watched as their joy and enthusiasm faded. They retreated to their room, spending more time in isolation than ever before. The days of movie nights and park visits were long gone. Now, it was all about making Ethan comfortable, catering to his every need. But the worst was yet to come. As the days turned into weeks, the dynamics of the house shifted even further. It was as though Stephen and Melissa had completely taken over. My parents, once supportive, now seemed to be bending over backward to cater to their every whim. They allowed Melissa to rearrange the kitchen, even though she'd never cooked a meal for the family. She complained about the healthy snacks I bought for the twins, saying they weren't good enough for Ethan, and I was the one who ended up cleaning up her laundry left in the washing machine for days. One evening, I overheard Stephen and my father talking in the living room. "We might need to extend the renovation timeline," Stephen was saying, his voice casually dismissive. "There are some issues with the foundation." "Stay as long as you need," my father replied without hesitation. "This is your home, too." The words cut through me like a knife. I had been led to believe my stay here was temporary, that I was just getting a leg up while I found my own place. But in my father's mind, Stephen's family was entitled to the house forever, and no one cared enough to even ask how I felt about it. By early October, it became unbearable. I came home from work one evening to find Jack sitting on the back porch, alone and upset. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked, sitting beside him as he hugged his knees to his chest. "Grandma told me I was being too loud with my jump rope," he said, voice quivering. But Ethan was in the living room with Aunt Melissa, and he wasn't even sleeping. She just didn't want to hear me. I felt a knot in my stomach. My son, my sensitive, creative boy, was being told he was too much. That night, I decided it was time for a conversation with my parents. I needed to understand what was happening. But when I tried to address the issue with them, I was met with dismissive attitudes and veiled criticism. "You're overreacting, Amanda," my mother sighed. "Kids need to learn that babies require more attention. Ethan is just a baby." "And I've been a single parent for 2 years," I countered, trying to keep my voice calm. "I understand, but I'm worried about how Jack and Emma feel. They don't feel like they matter here anymore." "That's just your jealousy talking," my mother replied coldly, brushing me off with the flick of her hand. I stood there, frozen. Was that really how they saw me? As a jealous sister, not a concerned mother. The situation only worsened as the days went on. My children were constantly being pushed aside, treated like they didn't belong. Emma's clarinet practice was interrupted by Melissa, who complained that Ethan was napping and she needed quiet for an important work call. Emma had been practicing for her school band evaluation, but now she was missing her session, something that could affect her performance. I tried to reason with Melissa, suggesting we could work out a schedule that worked for everyone. But she shot me down, dismissing Emma's passion for her music as if it didn't matter. It was always Ethan's needs that came first. Then came a conversation that would change everything. One Sunday evening, we sat down for a family dinner. The usual tension in the air was thick as we all sat around the table, and that's when it happened. My mother, in her ever-so-patient voice, turned to Jack and Emma. "You're lucky to have a roof over your heads," she said, her words laced with an unspoken judgment. "When I was your age, we ate what was put in front of us. No complaints." I could feel the weight of her words settling on my kids' shoulders, but it didn't stop there. Ethan, who had been a fussy eater all evening, suddenly threw his plate on the floor in a tantrum. Instead of reprimanding him, my mother laughed and said, He's just exploring his world." Jack's face fell as he stared at the mess, but it wasn't the mess that bothered him. It was the double standard. After dinner, I found the twins' artwork gone from the refrigerator, replaced by photos of Ethan and a printout of his daycare schedule. My heart broke as I saw my kids' pride, something they'd worked so hard on, replaced with yet another reminder of how they weren't important enough. It was in that moment that I realized something. My kids didn't just feel unwanted, they were unwanted, and I had been allowing it to happen, hoping it would change. By mid-October, I was exhausted. The emotional toll of living in this environment was wearing me down. I had become a ghost in my own life, doing everything to hold it all together while my parents and brother made decisions that hurt my kids. I was supposed to be the protector, the one who stood up for them, but all I felt like I was doing was walking on eggshells to avoid any more conflict. I had been taking extra shifts at the hospital, both to escape the tension at home and to save as much as I could. Every extra dollar was one step closer to freedom, but despite my efforts, it seemed like the situation was spiraling beyond my control. Stephen and Melissa's behavior was becoming more entitled, while my parents stood by, enabling them. The line had been crossed. It was no longer just about a temporary living arrangement. It was about my children's well-being and the constant erosion of their self-worth. Then, one day, Stephen called a family meeting. His voice, filled with false enthusiasm, rang out over the dinner table. "We've got exciting news," he began, his gaze shifting from my parents to me, avoiding eye contact. "We're finally going to do the major renovation on our house, the one we've been talking about for ages." My stomach churned as I prepared myself for the inevitable. I had seen this coming. My parents were so eager to help him to coddle his new family that they didn't see what was happening to mine. My mother's voice, sweet and unquestioning, followed. "That's wonderful, sweetie, but—" Melissa, cradling Ethan in her arms, continued, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We'll need somewhere to stay while the construction is going on. It should only be about 6 to 8 weeks. Before I could speak, my father cut in, eager to offer the only solution that seemed to matter. "Of course, you'll stay here," he said, as if it was his right to decide. "We have plenty of room." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had been warned that our stay was only temporary, but now the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about helping family. It was about them choosing sides. It wasn't even about whether it was fair to Jack and Emma anymore. It was about how invisible we had become in my parents' eyes. They had already made up their minds. I tried to argue, to explain that the house was already tight with the 5 of us, but my mother gave me a look that stopped me in my tracks. "Family helps family, Amanda. It's only temporary." Those words hung in the air like a suffocating weight. "Temporary," I repeated under my breath, feeling the sting of irony. I had been living in this temporary arrangement for nearly 2 years, and now I was being told it wasn't just about making room for Stephen and his family, it was about making room for them at the expense of mine. The next weekend, Stephen and Melissa moved in with Ethan, and the atmosphere in the house shifted again. The twins' toys, which had already been restricted to their bedroom and a small corner of the living room, were now considered clutter. They were told to keep their voices down because Ethan was napping, though he wasn't even in his room most of the day. The TV, which they used to watch for an hour after school, was now constantly tuned to Melissa's preferred channels, leaving my children with little space to themselves. That night, I found Emma sitting alone on the back porch, her face red and streaked with tears. My heart broke when I saw her. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked, sitting beside her. "Grandma said I was being too loud with my jump rope in the backyard," she said quietly. But Ethan wasn't even asleep. He was in the living room with Aunt Melissa. She just didn't want to hear me counting my jumps. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, trying to stay calm for her sake. I hugged her tight, but inside I was burning with anger. My daughter, who had always been so confident, was shrinking, becoming smaller in this space, just like her brother. And so, I made a decision that night. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I couldn't continue to allow my children to feel unwanted, second class in their own family. The next morning, I called a realtor friend of mine, determined to find a way out. I needed to get us out of this toxic environment, away from my parents, away from Stephen and Melissa. And it had to be now. Enough was enough. The days that followed were a blur of intense emotions. My mind raced, thoughts bouncing from one concern to another: how to protect Jack and Emma, how to secure a future for us outside the toxic dynamic that had become my parents' home. I was tired of making excuses, of pretending everything was fine when it was so clearly not. I hadn't shared my plan with anyone yet, not even Jack and Emma. I didn't want to get their hopes up, but I knew deep down that I couldn't let this continue any longer. I had already started looking at rental properties, and there was one small house in particular that I had my eye on. It wasn't fancy, but it was within my budget, and more importantly, it was in a good school district. It felt like the fresh start I so desperately needed, but I couldn't make any moves without first having one final conversation with my parents. I had to make it clear that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about my kids, about their dignity, their happiness. They deserved better than the situation we were in, and I would do whatever it took to give that to them. It came to a head during a family dinner that October. The house was bustling with the usual tension, and I could see Jack and Emma retreating into themselves more than usual. I had tried to keep them out of the drama, but it was impossible. They could feel the atmosphere. They could see the difference in how they were treated compared to Ethan, their younger cousin, who had become the center of attention. As we sat down to eat, I couldn't take it anymore. My mother had made all of Stephen's favorite foods, none of which Jack or Emma liked. When Jack, polite as always, asked if there was anything else to eat, my mother's response hit me like a slap in the face. "You're being ungrateful," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "When I was your age, we ate what was put in front of us. That was it. The injustice of it all became too much to bear." Jack, who had always been easygoing, was now struggling with anxiety. He'd never complained before, but his spirit was being crushed. I could see it in his eyes, the confusion, the hurt, and Emma, who had always been so bold, was retreating too. They were learning to shrink themselves in a space where they should have been celebrated, not ignored. As the meal continued, I watched my mother and father dote on Ethan, their first grandson, while Jack and Emma were left to sit in silence. Ethan, not yet a year old, threw his plate on the floor, making a mess. Everyone laughed it off, as if it was the most adorable thing in the world. Yet, when Jack had been younger, my parents had never allowed that kind of behavior. The double standard was impossible to ignore. It was like my children weren't even seen as important enough to matter. This was no longer about me being sensitive or jealous. It was about the very real emotional toll this was taking on my kids. That night, after the twins had gone to bed, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to act. I had been saving, scrimping, and planning for months. It was time to put my plan into motion. I called my realtor friend and set up a meeting for the next day. The house I had my eye on, the one that would be our new home, was available for move-in within 2 weeks. The timing was perfect. I could finally give Jack and Emma the stability they needed. But first, I needed to have one final conversation with my parents. It was the hardest thing I had done in years, but I knew it had to be done. The day after the dinner, I sat down with them. The twins were at school, and I had the space to finally confront the elephant in the room. "I have to talk to you about something important," I began, trying to steady my nerves. "I know you've been helping me, and I appreciate it, but the way things have been going, it's not working. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." My father, never one to show much emotion, frowned. "What do you mean, Amanda? We've been helping you for almost 2 years now." "I know," I said softly, "but what's been happening here is hurting my children. I can't watch them continue to be treated this way. They deserve to be treated with the same love and respect as Ethan. We can't stay here anymore." My mother looked shocked. "But this is your family, Amanda. We've done so much for you." I shook my head. "It's not about that. It's about the way Jack and Emma feel. They feel unwanted here. They feel like they don't matter, and that's not okay. You moved them to the basement without asking me, without considering how it would affect them. It's not about comfort, it's about respect. They deserve better than this." There was a long silence as my parents exchanged glances. I could see them grappling with my words, the truth that had been hard for me to even admit. My father sighed, running his hand through his hair. "We didn't mean for it to be like that, Amanda." "I know you didn't," I said gently. "But you have to understand that this isn't about favoritism. It's about my children feeling like they belong. They deserve to be seen, too." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. After that conversation, I had a sense of finality about it all. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally standing up for my children, putting their needs before anyone else's, including my parents. It wasn't an easy decision, and the weight of it lingered in the back of my mind, but I knew it was the right one. I had signed the lease for the small house just a week ago. It was modest, yes, but it was ours, and that meant everything to me. The house was in a good neighborhood, close to the twins' school and my work at the hospital. It wasn't the dream home I had once envisioned, but it was a safe haven, a place where Jack and Emma could feel loved and respected, something I hadn't felt in my parents' home for a long time. I kept everything to myself for now. I didn't want to raise false hopes for the kids, and I especially didn't want to deal with any more interference from my parents. The next week, I drove out to the new house and made arrangements to move in. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect, or as close to perfect as it could be, before we moved in. But the reality of the situation soon caught up with me. My parents had been calling nonstop, leaving voicemails full of concern and confusion, asking if we were really going to leave. They were upset, hurt, and I could hear it in their voices, but I wasn't about to back down. I had to do this for the kids. This was about creating a space where they could breathe, where they weren't constantly reminded that they were second-class citizens in their own family. As the day of the move drew closer, I started preparing the twins. I told them we were getting ready to leave. I didn't want to shock them too much, so I kept things light. I explained that we were moving to a new house, a place where they could have their own rooms, where they could be themselves, and most importantly, where they would never have to feel less than. "Are we really leaving Grandma and Grandpa's house?" Emma asked me one evening, her voice tinged with confusion and excitement. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, trying to reassure her. "We're going to a place where we can all be happy together. I know it's a big change, but it's going to be a good one." Jack was quieter, as usual, but I could see the glimmer of relief in his eyes. I had been so focused on the bigger picture that I hadn't realized just how much the twins were affected. They were both incredibly resilient, but their hearts were breaking too. The night before we were set to move, I stayed up late, packing the last few boxes. The house was silent, the weight of everything pressing in on me. It was one of those nights where I wished I didn't have to do this alone, where I could lean on someone else for a change. But deep down, I knew I couldn't rely on my parents or my brother anymore. I had to do this for us. For the kids, the next morning the twins were excited. I had packed their favorite things the night before, and now they were bouncing around, eager to see our new home. I smiled, even though part of me was still bracing for the backlash from my parents. As we loaded the car, I caught sight of my parents in the driveway, standing silently by the garage. My father looked angry, while my mother's face was twisted with sorrow, her eyes red from crying. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to say. The reality of what I was doing hit me again, but it was too late to turn back. "Goodbye," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "We'll be back for our things soon." My mother stepped forward, her voice shaky. "Amanda, please don't do this. This is your family. We'll work things out. We didn't mean to hurt you." "I know you didn't," I replied, struggling to keep my composure. "But you hurt my kids, and that's something I can't forgive." With that, I turned and walked toward the car, trying to keep the tears at bay. My children, who had been so quiet up until now, were anxiously waiting in the backseat. I could feel their eyes on me, and I knew this was the moment that would define our future. We drove off without looking back. The house that had been home for nearly 2 years was no longer our home. It was time to create something new. The drive to our new house was silent at first, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chatter from Jack and Emma. I could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This was it. We were leaving behind everything we had known, stepping into a new life where we would no longer be defined by the past. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the familiar outline of my parents' house growing smaller with each passing mile. It was strange how both painful and liberating it felt to drive away. For so long, I had tried to make that house work, tried to make them understand the toll their favoritism was taking on my children, but I had reached my limit. I had to choose my kids, even if it meant leaving behind everything I had once known as family. The house we were headed to was small, but it was ours. It was everything I had been working for, financially, emotionally, and physically. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No bickering, no constant tension in the air, just silence, but it wasn't the empty kind of silence. It was peaceful. We spent the rest of the day unloading and settling in. The twins were excited to see their new rooms. They immediately began unpacking their things, placing their favorite toys and books in their spaces, filling the walls with color and life. I watched them, my heart swelling with pride and relief. This was the beginning of something new, something better for them. They would finally have a space where they were the priority, where their achievements were celebrated, not ignored. As I unpacked the last of the boxes, I found myself smiling. It wasn't the big house I had once dreamed of, but it was a home, and that was all that mattered. That evening, as the sun set, I took a moment to reflect. I was sitting on the porch, watching Jack and Emma play in the backyard, their laughter filling the air. It was the kind of sound I had missed for so long. The kind of sound that told me we were finally free. The phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my mother, something I had been expecting for days but hadn't wanted to face. I opened it, reading her words carefully. "Amanda, we've been thinking about everything. Your father and I want to apologize for how we treated you and the kids. We never meant to hurt you. If you're open to it, we'd like to talk. Please let us know when you're ready." I sat there for a long time, reading and rereading the message. Part of me wanted to immediately text back, to open the door for reconciliation. But another part of me hesitated. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting my kids and making sure they felt seen, heard, and loved. I knew that the road to healing would take time, but it would only happen when everyone was ready to acknowledge what had happened and why it needed to change. I wasn't sure if I was ready yet. As the evening wore on, I watched my children fall asleep in their own rooms, finally at peace. It was a quiet, simple night, but it was exactly what we needed. I stood up, took a deep breath, and sent a message back to my mother. "Thank you, Mom. We'll talk soon. But right now, we need time to settle into our new life. I hope you understand." I hit send and put my phone down. Tomorrow would come with its own set of challenges, but for tonight, we were home. And that was enough.